The storm arrived without warning, the way the worst storms always do, not gradually, not politely, but all at once. By 9 o'clock that evening, the small lakeside town of Millhaven had already lost power on 3 streets, and the wind was howling through the gaps in fences and window frames with a sound like something alive and furious. Rain came sideways. It came in sheets. It hammered the tin roofs and flooded the gutters and turned the dirt roads between the older houses into long rivers of thick brown mud. Branches cracked and fell. Trash cans rolled down empty streets. The kind of storm old-timers would talk about for years was arriving on a Tuesday in late October. And Millhaven was not ready. Ethan Cole stood in his kitchen when he heard the first crash from across the field. He already had his rain jacket halfway on. He had been watching the sky for the last 2 hours. And when the sound came, a deep, tearing groan, followed by the clatter of wood and metal, he did not hesitate. He called out to his daughter, told her to put on her boots and grab the big flashlight from the hall closet. And by the time Lily appeared at the door, with her rain slicker buttoned to the collar, Ethan was already loading spare nails and a roll of heavy-gauge tarp into the old canvas bag he kept by the door for nights like this. Lily was 8 years old and serious in the way that children become serious when they have lived without certain things for long enough. She did not ask questions. She followed her father into the rain. The house across the field belonged to Walter and Margaret Harris, and it had been standing on that same lot since before Ethan was born. The clapboard siding had been painted and repainted so many times the layers had begun to peel back like the pages of a very old book. The porch sagged on one side. The gutters were held in place with wire and good intentions. But it was home deeply, irreplaceably home, and the people inside it had been in Millhaven longer than the paved road that ran past their front gate. When Ethan reached the yard, Walter Harris was already outside in the dark in his undershirt and work pants, holding a useless umbrella against a wind that had long since stopped caring about umbrellas. A large section of the roof over the back bedroom had peeled away, and the wooden joists underneath were exposed to the full fury of the storm. Margaret stood in the doorway with her hands pressed to her mouth and water running down her face. Ethan did not say anything dramatic. He just put the bag down on the porch, pulled out the tarp, and climbed the ladder that was already leaning against the side of the house. The rungs were slick, and the wind came in hard gusts that made the whole structure shiver. But he climbed anyway, moving carefully, testing each step. Below, Lily held the flashlight with both hands and aimed the beam up at the roof, keeping it steady, adjusting as her father moved. She was shivering, but she did not complain. Walter tried to help from the ground, his old hands gripping the base of the ladder, and Margaret brought out a thermos of coffee that nobody had time to drink. The night smelled like wet earth and pine resin, and something electrical, like the sky itself had been split open and left raw. Ethan worked for 90 minutes in the driving rain before the tarp was secured well enough to hold until morning. By the time he came back down, his hands were cut in 2 places from a jagged nail head, and his jacket was soaked clean through. Lily wrapped her arms around his waist without a word. Walter gripped his shoulder the way men do when they cannot find the right words. Margaret pressed her palms together and looked at Ethan like he had done something sacred, which, in the unspoken language of Millhaven, perhaps he had. That was the moment the headlights appeared. They came fast, far too fast for a flooded road in the middle of a storm, cutting through the dark from the direction of the new construction site on the eastern edge of town. The vehicle was black, enormous, the kind of SUV that cost more than most families in Millhaven earned in 3 years. It hit the water-filled pothole at the edge of the dirt road without slowing, without swerving. And the splash it threw was not accidental. The arc of brown water and thick mud rose in a high, deliberate curve and came down directly on Lily. She gasped and stumbled back. The mud was in her hair, across her face, soaked into the front of her jacket from collar to waist. She stood there, blinking, one hand still gripping the flashlight, too stunned to cry. The SUV stopped. The driver's window came down. The man behind the wheel looked out at them with the expression of someone who has never once had to apologize for anything and had no intention of starting tonight. He was handsome in an expensive, maintained way, dark hair. A jaw like it had been designed by committee. A cashmere coat that probably cost more than Ethan's truck. He looked at Lily, then at Ethan, then at the sagging old house behind them, and something shifted in his face, not embarrassment, not guilt, but a kind of cold amusement. The amusement of a man who has always found poverty decorative and a little funny. "Rats belong in the mud," he said. His voice was perfectly flat, perfectly casual, like he was reading a weather report. The window went back up. The SUV pulled away. Mud dripped from the tip of Lily's nose. She froze. She did not cry yet. She was waiting to understand what had just happened to her, and the understanding arrived slowly. The way cold does first at the edges, then deeper, until it reached something she couldn't name but could feel with absolute precision. Then the tears came. Ethan wiped the mud from Lily's cheek without saying a word. He did it slowly, carefully, with the same focused attention he had given the roof. His jaw was tight. His eyes followed the receding taillights until they disappeared around the bend. Walter Harris said a word under his breath that he had not used in 40 years. Margaret pulled Lily against her and held her. Lily had not done anything. That was the part that lodged in Ethan's chest like something with a barb. She had been standing in the rain, holding a flashlight for an hour and a half, 8 years old, cold through to her bones, doing the thing she always did when her father needed help, showing up without complaint, and doing the job. She had not provoked anything. She had not been loud or in the way. She had simply existed in a spot where someone with more money than decency had decided she did not deserve to be dry. Ethan set down the hammer he was still holding and crouched in front of his daughter in the mud, and looked at her face, and what he saw there was not just sadness, but something older, the beginning of a question she would be asking herself for years, about what kind of world she lived in, and whether the world had decided something about her before she had a chance to decide anything about herself. He had seen it before. Not in his daughter, but in himself, years ago. In a different life. On a different kind of rough night. He had grown up with enough, but not always. And he knew from experience that the wound left by contempt was not like the wound left by poverty. Poverty, you could fight. You could plan your way out of it. Work your way out. Educate your way out. Build something piece by piece until the math changed. But contempt, the particular contempt of someone who looks at you and decides you are less, that stayed in the body, in ways that were harder to locate and much harder to fix. Ethan had carried that knowledge quietly for 38 years. And watching it land on his daughter's face in the rain, watching her try to blink through it with that small, determined dignity she had inherited from a mother she barely remembered, was the closest Ethan had come in a long time to losing the composure he kept around himself like a second coat. He did not lose it. He dried her face. He held her hand the whole way back to the Harris kitchen. He sat with her at the table and let Margaret bring her a towel and a cup of hot cocoa and the particular warmth of an old kitchen in a storm. And when Lily finally asked quietly, still sniffling, looking into her cup whether people who had a lot of money always acted that way, Ethan gave her the honest answer, the answer that was both true and something she could hold on to. "Not all of them," he said. "Just the ones who confused what they owned with who they were." Lily thought about this. She wrapped her hands around the cup. She did not ask anything else. Walter Harris, sitting across the table with his big hands wrapped around his own cup, looked at Ethan over the steam with an expression that contained several decades of things he had learned about the world and had mostly stopped saying out loud. He said nothing. He did not need to. Ethan looked back at him and then stood and said he was going back out to finish the tarp, because the wind was still coming and the tarp was still only half secured, and a job left half done was worse than no job at all. He pulled his jacket back on and went out into the rain alone. The man in the black SUV was Victor Kane. He had arrived in Millhaven 11 weeks earlier with a construction crew, a real estate attorney, and the kind of confidence that fills a room before its owner walks in. He had purchased a development agreement on 40 acres of lakefront land and announced to anyone who would listen, and quite a few who would not, that he intended to build a private luxury resort that would, in his words, Transform this forgotten little town into something worth coming back to. He said this in the hardware store. He said it at the diner. He said it at the town planning office, while the clerk nodded politely and silently calculated how much he disliked this man. Victor Kane had made a fortune in commercial real estate in the city, and he had brought with him to Millhaven the unshakable conviction that money was a form of intelligence, and that the people here simply lacked the imagination to understand how lucky they were. He was 44 years old, and had not, in the past decade, gone anywhere without an entourage or a purpose. He flew business class on short flights because he had decided at some point that coach was for people who had not yet understood that every minor upgrade was a message you sent to yourself about what you were worth. He had 2 phones, 3 attorneys, and the particular energy of a man who interprets all obstacles as failures of imagination on the part of other people. He had never in his adult life stood in the rain, holding something in place for someone else's benefit. He had funded things, certainly. He had written checks, but there was a difference, a very large and very important difference between writing a check and climbing a wet roof in the dark, and Victor Kane had arranged his life carefully so that he would never have to know what that difference felt like from the inside. That night, in the half-finished main lodge of his resort project, Victor Kane poured 2 glasses of Bordeaux for himself and the woman visiting from the city, and told the story of the mud splash the way a comedian tells a bit he's already tested, timing the pause before the punchline, watching her face for the laugh. The woman laughed. Victor refilled both glasses. Outside, the storm howled, and the lake churned, and the lights from the construction site flickered in the rain. He did not think about the little girl in the yellow slicker. He did not think about her father. He thought about his projected ROI, and his projected opening date, and the architecture firm in Milan that had quoted him a figure that was somehow both outrageous and exciting. He slept well that night. He always did. In the morning, the storm was gone. Millhaven looked wrung-out branches everywhere, standing water in the low-lying lots, fences knocked sideways and driveways buried under a slick of leaves and mud. Ethan arrived at the Harris house just after 7, with a box of tools and a bag of coffee and pastries from the gas station, which was the closest thing Millhaven had to a bakery. Lily had not wanted to come this morning, and Ethan had not pushed her. She was quiet at breakfast. She was quiet in the car. When he dropped her at school, she got out without looking back. And that bothered him in a way he carried around all day, like a stone in his shoe. Walter met him on the porch. The 2 men walked the property together in the early gray light, assessing what the storm had done, making the list of what needed to be fixed first and what could wait. The back section of roof was worse than Ethan had thought in the dark. There was water damage in the bedroom ceiling, some softening of the subfloor near the window, and the old rain gutter on the north side had pulled away from the fascia entirely and was hanging by a single screw. Ethan wrote it all down in the small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket, and Walter watched him with the quiet gratitude of a man who is old enough to know that help like this is rare and should not be taken for granted. Inside, over coffee at the kitchen table, Margaret set out the tin of documents she kept in the back of the linen closet, the one with the rubber band around it, and the handwritten label that said "Important" in her neat, careful cursive. She needed Ethan to take a folder of paperwork down to Bob Garrett's law office by noon. Bob handled all their property matters, had for decades, and there was a lease renewal packet that needed to be filed before the end of the month. Ethan took the folder. He did not open it at the table. The law office of Robert Garrett was 3 blocks off Main Street, above the old pharmacy, and it smelled of old paper and floor wax, and the particular dusty comfort of a place that had been doing things the same way for a very long time. Bob Garrett was 63, semi-retired, and had the solid, unhurried manner of a man who had seen enough drama in contracts and deeds to last several lifetimes. He was on the phone when Ethan arrived, but waved him in and pointed at the chair. Ethan sat. He set the folder on the edge of the desk and glanced at the top page while he waited. The name printed at the top of the lease document was Victor Kane Holdings, LLC. He read it once. He read it again. He set the folder down and looked out the window at the gray street below and said nothing when Bob got off the phone. He just waited and thought. And by the time Bob turned to greet him, something in Ethan's expression had settled into a kind of careful stillness. The lease was for the 40 acres of lakefront land that Victor Kane was building on. The Harris family had owned that land since the 1950s, purchased by Walter's father, at a time when it was considered too swampy and remote to be worth anything much. Over the decades, as the lake became a destination and the surrounding land appreciated, the Harrises had quietly become the owners of one of the most valuable parcels in the county. They had never developed it. They had never sold it. They had leased a portion of it, years back, for a modest seasonal use. And then the current lease had been negotiated by a city real estate group on Victor Kane's behalf, aggressively priced, heavy with fine print, and set to expire in less than 90 days. Bob Garrett explained this with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to present facts without editorializing, but his eyes said the rest. The lease was the foundation that Victor Kane's entire project rested on. The construction, the permits, the bank financing, all of it was built on nothing more than a handshake with a clock ticking. Ethan drove back to the Harris house in silence. He fixed the rain gutter. He patched a section of the bedroom ceiling with plaster. He replaced 3 boards on the porch that had rotted through. He worked until late afternoon and then drove to pick up Lily from school. In the car, she stared at the window, and he did not fill the silence with noise. At home, she did her homework at the kitchen table while he made dinner. And somewhere between the pasta and the salad, she looked up at him and asked, in the direct way of children who have been thinking about something all day, whether the man in the black car was a bad person. Ethan stirred the sauce for a moment before answering. Not all rich people are bad, he told her. Only the ones who think money makes them better than other people. Lily looked at him for a long moment, then looked back at her homework. She wrote something in her notebook. He did not ask what. The landslide came 4 days later. It was a narrow strip of hillside on the eastern edge of the construction site, destabilized by the storm's saturation of the soil. And it took down a section of retaining wall, buried one of the excavators to its cab in mud, and sent a slow brown wave across the access road that cut off the site from the main road for the better part of a morning. Nobody was hurt. The structural damage was significant, but manageable. What was not manageable was what came next. The phone calls, the emails, the emergency meeting with the bank, and the voice of Victor's project manager saying the words that Victor Kane had never in his life been prepared to hear. The permits were on hold, the construction timeline was suspended, and the bank required documentation confirming the legal status of the lease before a single further draw on the construction loan would be released. Victor had spent the previous evening reassuring his lead investor over the phone that the storm damage was cosmetic, that the timeline was flexible, that these things happened in construction, and the important thing was how you responded. He had sounded confident. He was good at sounding confident. He had been practicing since the age of 23, when he had walked into his first bank meeting in a suit that was slightly too large and convinced a loan officer to extend him a credit line on the basis of a business plan, and what the officer later described to a colleague as an almost supernatural certainty. Confidence had been the lever that opened every door. He had never once sat in a room and admitted, out loud or even to himself, that he did not know what would happen next. He was sitting in that room now, and he did not know. Victor's attorney found the problem in an afternoon. The lease was expiring. The original agreement had a provision for renewal by mutual consent, but that consent had never been formally requested, never been formally given, and the clock was now running hard. Without a signed renewal, the bank would pull the financing. Without the financing, the contractors would walk. Without the contractors, 3 months of poured concrete and framed walls and Italian marble samples sitting in a warehouse in the city would amount to the most expensive mistake Victor Kane had ever made, and he had made some expensive mistakes. He sat in the half-furnished lodge with his attorney and stared at the projected numbers and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular cold sensation of something slipping out from under him. "Who owns the land?" he asked. His attorney told him. Victor asked how he had never looked into this before. His attorney gave an answer that was technically accurate and practically useless. Victor stood up, buttoned his coat, and drove to the address his attorney had given him. He had a lot of practice at walking into rooms and making people feel grateful for his attention. He was confident, going in, that this would be straightforward. He recognized the house immediately, the sagging porch, the old painted siding, the field behind it, with its permanent smell of wet grass. He sat in the SUV for a moment before getting out. And in that moment, the full shape of the situation assembled itself in his mind, with a clarity that he did not appreciate at all. He got out anyway. He walked to the door anyway. He knocked with the controlled authority of a man who has decided that whatever awkwardness is coming, he will absorb it with his confidence intact. Margaret Harris answered. She looked at him with the face of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, offered him a chair at the kitchen table, and called for Walter. Victor sat. He looked around the small kitchen, the photographs on the wall, the old appliances, the mason jar of dried flowers on the windowsill, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it behind his eyes. Walter came in from the back of the house and shook Victor's hand without warmth and sat down across the table. Victor explained his situation with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to business meetings. He needed the lease renewed. He was prepared to be generous. He hoped they could come to an arrangement that worked for everyone. Walter Harris listened with his hands flat on the table. Then he said, quietly and without any apparent emotion, that the person Victor needed to speak to was not him. He said it was someone who managed the legal side of their land holdings. He said that person had full power of attorney over all decisions related to the property. Victor nodded, still composed, and asked when this person could be reached. The door from the back hallway opened. Ethan Cole walked in, setting a tool bag on the floor, pulling off his work gloves. He stopped when he saw Victor. Victor stopped when he saw Ethan. In the kitchen, the clock on the wall ticked through 4 seconds of absolute silence. Lily had come in from the yard behind Ethan, and she stopped too, one hand on the doorframe, looking at the man in the cashmere coat with the total, accurate recognition of a child who remembers a face that has frightened her. Victor saw her. He registered the recognition in her eyes. He looked back at Ethan. Ethan crossed the kitchen and set a thin folder of documents on the table in front of Victor Kane. And he did not raise his voice. And he did not move quickly. And the steadiness of him in that moment was more unnerving to Victor than anything loud could have been. "You have power of attorney," Victor said. It was not quite a question. "I do," Ethan said. Victor looked at the folder, then at Ethan, then at the folder again. When he looked up a second time, there was something happening behind his eyes that he was working hard to suppress. "I'd like to discuss the lease renewal," he said. "I know," Ethan said. He pulled out the chair across from Victor and sat down. He placed both hands on the table. He looked at Victor Kane with the patient, level attention of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. Then, without heat, without drama, he said, "Yesterday you called my daughter a rat." The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret Harris looked at her hands. Walter Harris looked at Victor. Lily, in the doorway, did not move. Victor Kane opened his mouth, and nothing came out. The next 2 hours were unlike any 2 hours Victor Kane had experienced in his professional life. He had been in difficult negotiations before he had sat across from lawyers who wanted to take him apart, investors who thought they had leverage, city officials who expected to be paid for their cooperation. He was good at this. He was very good at this. But the man sitting across from him at the kitchen table of an old farmhouse on the edge of a lake town was operating by rules that Victor did not have a playbook for. Ethan Cole was not performing. He was not posturing. He was not running a strategy. He was simply sitting there, completely present, and letting Victor Kane do all the work of being uncomfortable. Victor tried money first. He outlined a revised lease payment substantially higher than the current rate, higher even than market value for comparable lakefront property. Ethan listened without expression. Victor offered to fund repairs to the Harris house personally, as a gesture of goodwill. Ethan said the house was already being repaired. Victor suggested a community development contribution money for the town, a real asset, a legacy that would outlast both of them. Ethan picked up his coffee cup. He took a sip. He set it down. He said, That was a generous offer. Then he said he hadn't decided anything yet, and he stood up. And he told Victor he would be in touch, and he meant it as a conclusion, not an invitation. Victor stood outside the Harris house in the afternoon light, with his attorney's number ready in his hand, and for a long moment he just stood there, looking at the field, at the lake glinting silver in the distance, at the construction cranes visible against the horizon. The math was very simple. If Ethan Cole chose not to renew the lease, the bank would call the loan. The loan was secured against assets that Victor had assembled over a decade of hard work. The project would fail. The failure would cascade. He had seen it happen to other people. He had never once imagined it happening to him. Lily was sitting on the porch step when Victor turned to go. She was tying her shoe. She looked up at him once, quickly, and then back down at the lace. Victor stood there for a moment, and then he got in his car, and he drove back to the unfinished lodge, and he sat alone in the half-dark and thought about the mud on her face. What Ethan Cole had built in Millhaven was quiet and mostly invisible. The way anything built on patience and consistency tends to be. He had come here 6 years ago, after the hospital bills for his wife Claire's treatment had taken most of what they had saved, and after Claire herself had died on a Wednesday morning in March, while Lily was still too young to understand that the word gone could be permanent. He had been a structural engineer before, good at it, well paid, respected in a field that rewards precision and dislikes surprises. After Claire, he had taken a simpler job, then no job at all for a while. Then slowly, carefully, piece by piece, he had rebuilt something that fit the life he was actually living rather than the one he had planned. The Harrises had been the first people in Millhaven to treat him like he already belonged. Margaret had arrived at his door with a casserole on his 3rd day in town, before he had introduced himself to anyone. Walter had offered the use of his tools without being asked. They were in their 70s, their children were elsewhere, and they had accumulated, over the decades, a small legal complexity of property documents and lease agreements that had outlasted the original attorney who drafted them, and the filing systems that once made sense of them. Ethan had started helping with the paperwork as a way of doing something concrete with his hands in the evenings. 3 years later, the Harrises had formally given him power of attorney over their land holdings, and he had accepted it with the solemnity it deserved, and the practical understanding that it was mostly a matter of renewing leases and signing off on surveys and making sure nothing expired that shouldn't. He had not known, when he accepted, that the lease structure on the lakefront parcel would someday put him across a table from the man who had driven a $1,000 SUV through a storm and aimed it at his daughter. The second storm came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Victor's visit. It was smaller than the first, more a long, heavy rain than a true storm, but it arrived after the ground was already saturated, and by midnight, the drainage channels on the construction site had overflowed, and water was pooling inside the main lodge structure. Victor was there when it happened. He had been sleeping on a cot in the site office because the commute from the city had started to feel like a concession he wasn't willing to make, and also because being near the project made him feel like he still had some control over it, which was less true than it had been. He heard the water before he saw it, a kind of collective trickling and then a rushing, and when he went outside in the dark with a flashlight, he found that the access road had flooded in one section and his truck was on the wrong side of it. He had gone into the materials storage building to retrieve the binder of original engineering documents, the ones he needed to show the bank's inspector in the morning, when the door behind him swelled in its frame and jammed. The water outside was rising, not dangerously, not quickly, but steadily. And the building had no second exit, and his phone had 3% battery and no signal inside the corrugated metal walls. He tried the door twice, then looked around for something to pry it with. And that was when he heard the knock from outside, a single, heavy knock. The kind that means, "I know you're there." Ethan Cole had a crowbar. He had driven by the site on his way home from the Harrises and seen the light in the storage building and the water rising around it, and had done the mental calculation that takes less than a second when you are the kind of person Ethan was. The door came open. Victor came out. They stood in the rain looking at each other, with the very specific expression of two men who had been in a conflict that was not yet resolved, but who were also, At this moment, simply wet. They took shelter. They sat on opposite sides of the space and listened to the rain hammer the roof, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Then Victor said, not loudly, not performing, but with the kind of flatness that replaces emotion when a man has been carrying something for too long. I grew up in a place like this. He was not looking at Ethan when he said it. He was looking at the rain. Not like this exactly. A mill town. Different state. But the same kind of place. Small. Everyone knew what everyone had and what everyone didn't. He paused. I didn't have much. Another pause. The kids who had more, they had a way of letting you know it. Every day. Small ways. Big ways. You don't forget. Ethan said nothing. He was listening in the complete way that had always made people tell him things they hadn't planned to say. I told myself, Victor continued, and his voice had gone somewhere private. Somewhere that sounded like the inside of a room he hadn't opened in a long time. That if I ever had money, I wouldn't let anyone put me in that position again. Not ever. And I didn't. And somewhere along the way I forgot which direction I was pointed. He stopped. He looked at the lake for a while. I was horrible to your daughter, he said. There's no context that makes it not that. Ethan looked at his hands. They were still marked from the first storm. The 2 cuts from the nail had healed to thin pink lines. But the shape of that night was still on him. He said, being poor doesn't make a person small. Being cruel does. Victor did not answer immediately. When he did, it was only 2 words. I know. And something in the way he said it made Ethan believe him. Not because Victor had suddenly become a different person, but because he sounded, for the first time since he'd arrived in Millhaven, like an actual one. They sat in the rain sound for another hour, before the water on the access road dropped enough to drive through. They did not shake hands when they parted. They did not make promises, but when Ethan walked to his truck, he walked the way a man walks, when something he had been holding has lightened by a precise and specific degree. 3 mornings later, Victor Kane knocked on the door of the Harris house at 8:15. He had left his attorney at the lodge. He had left his phone in the car. He was wearing the kind of clothes he had not put on in years, a plain jacket, work pants, boots that weren't new. He knocked, and Margaret Harris opened the door, and he asked if he might come in, please. They were all there, Ethan, Walter, Margaret, Lily at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal she had stopped eating. Victor stood in the doorway for a moment after Margaret waved him in. He looked at the kitchen, the photographs, the dried flowers, the coffee cups, the Tuesday morning ordinariness of it all, and he looked at these 4 people, and whatever composure he had constructed on the drive over began to come apart before he had said a single word. He apologized to Walter and Margaret first. He said their home and their property and their years in this town deserved more respect than he had given them. He said this plainly, without the cadence of a prepared speech, and they listened with the dignified patience of people who had heard a great many things over the course of long lives. Then he turned to Ethan. He said that the way he had treated his family, the words he had used, the deliberateness of the moment, the contempt was not something he could explain away, and he was not going to try. He said he had spent 3 weeks thinking about what it must have felt like to be Lily in that moment, and the thinking had not been comfortable. Then he turned to Lily. She was sitting very straight in her chair. She was watching him with the focused attention of someone who has decided to pay very close attention and not be moved by anything less than the truth. Victor crossed the kitchen and crouched down beside her chair so that he was at her level, not towering, not performing benevolence from above, but genuinely level, eye to eye, and he said that what he had done to her was wrong, that she deserved an apology that was real and not just convenient, and that he was sorry. He said the words slowly, and there was nothing rehearsed in it. Lily looked at him for a long moment. She was 8 years old, and she had the kind of composure that some children develop when they have learned that dignity is something you keep inside yourself. I don't like being treated like trash, she said. That was all, but it landed with a weight that filled the kitchen. Victor's face did not do what faces do when people are performing emotion. It did what faces do when something hits the place that's been guarded too long. He pressed his lips together. He stood back up. He wiped one eye with the back of his hand and looked away at the window, and nobody in the kitchen said anything for a moment. And the silence was not cruel. It was the silence of a room, allowing something to finish. Ethan spoke next. He set a piece of paper on the table, not the lease renewal yet, just a handwritten list. He said that the families on the 3 streets closest to the construction site had sustained damage from the project's drainage failures over the past 2 months. He said those homes needed to be made whole. He said a storm resilience fund for the town managed independently, audited annually, would go a long way toward repairing not just structures, but the kind of trust that a community needs to function. He said these were not negotiating positions. They were the conditions under which he was prepared to recommend to the Harrises that the lease be renewed. Victor read the list. He read it a second time. He asked no questions about the cost, which told Ethan more than any answer would have. He said he would have everything arranged within 30 days. He said he understood these were not favors. He picked up a pen from the table and signed the acknowledgement at the bottom of the list, and then he looked at Ethan, and Ethan looked at him, and the measure they took of each other in that moment was something that neither of them would have predicted back when the mud was still wet. The lease renewal was signed the following Friday, in Bob Garrett's office, with Walter and Margaret Harris present, and Lily sitting in the corner chair reading a library book about wolves. It was a standard document. The terms were fair. Victor Kane's attorney was professional and efficient. The whole thing took less than 40 minutes. In the weeks that followed, a construction crew arrived on Maple Street, and then on Junction Road, and then on the cul-de-sac off Lakeview Drive, where the Pattersons' basement had been flooding since September. Victor did not announce this. He did not send a press release. He showed up on Maple Street on the first morning with coffee for the crew and stood in the yard talking to old Dennis Patterson about the drainage slope while the guys unloaded the equipment. Dennis Patterson, who had lived next to that construction site for 8 months and had said some very precise and particular things about Victor Kane at the hardware store, stood in his yard and drank the coffee and did not say anything for a while. Then he said the least Victor could do was fix the grade on the east side while they were at it. Victor said he'd have the engineer take a look. These things are small. But small things, done consistently, over time, are how trust is rebuilt in a place like Millhaven. The town did not throw a party. It did not issue a statement. It simply began to behave, in the incremental and unspoken way of small towns, as though Victor Kane was here, and was going to stay, and was possibly not the worst thing that had ever happened to the Lake Road. That was not a small concession. Millhaven's memory was long, and its judgment was proportional, and the fact that it was willing to recalibrate it all was a form of grace that Victor, in his previous life, would not have recognized as the gift it was. He began to recognize it now. He showed up at the town planning meetings, not to push a project through, but to listen. He fixed the drainage. He funded the storm resilience account that Ethan had outlined on that handwritten list, quietly, through Bob Garrett's office, without putting his name on it until someone asked directly. He hired locally when he could. He stopped talking about transforming the town and started asking what the town actually wanted. It was a different posture. It was slower. It produced fewer press releases and considerably more goodwill than any press release ever had. Victor Kane, who had spent 20 years moving fast and moving first, was learning, at 44, the discipline of stillness. By early spring, the construction site had a new name on the project sign, not the name Victor had originally chosen, which had involved the word luxury twice and the word exclusive once, but a simpler name, one that meant what it said. The town had not embraced Victor Kane. Exactly, towns with long memories do not embrace people quickly, and they shouldn't, but he was no longer a stranger in the way he had been. And that distinction mattered to him more than he would have predicted. Lily had stopped flinching when black SUVs went past on the road. This took longer than anything else, and Ethan noticed it the way he noticed most things about his daughter, quietly, without comment, with a private and careful relief. She had started asking more questions about the land records in the Harris family, about how long a family could own a piece of ground and what that meant, about why certain things were worth protecting. She was 8 years old, and she was already building something in her head that Ethan recognized. because he had built something like it himself. In the years after Claire, in the early mornings of Millhaven when the lake was flat and the town was quiet, and he was figuring out what he actually believed, what he had believed, on the other side of grief. On the other side of all the things he had chosen to put down and not pick back up, was something simple and difficult in equal measure, that a life shaped around the people you love and the work you do with your hands is not a lesser life. It is just a different measure of success, one that does not come with a press release or a projected ROI, but that shows up in other ways, in a child who holds a flashlight steady in a storm, in an old man who grips your shoulder without words, in a gate that swings clean on a Saturday morning. The Harris house looked better in April than it had in years. The roof was solid. The gutter ran clean. Margaret had planted something along the front walk that came up purple in the long spring light. Walter sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the lake and said, when Ethan asked how he was, that he was fine, which was true, which was enough. There is a kind of contentment that only comes to people who have lived long enough and honestly enough to have earned it, not the contentment of having solved everything, but of having stopped needing everything to be solved. Walter Harris had it. Margaret had it. It lived in their house like a piece of furniture that had been in the same spot so long it had left a mark on the floor. And every time Ethan sat at their table, he felt the quiet authority of it and was grateful for the reminder. On a Saturday in mid-April, Ethan and Lily were fixing the front gate. The hinge had rusted through over the winter, and the whole thing listed badly to the left when they heard a car slow on the road. It was a black SUV. Ethan registered it without reaction. Lily looked up, her hand still on the wrench, watching with the careful attention she gave to things that had once frightened her and might or might not still. The car came to a complete stop before the puddle at the edge of the driveway, waited for a moment, then pulled slowly and carefully around its edge, and continued up the road. No splash, no spray, no theatrical gesture, just a car, driven by someone who had decided, somewhere between one version of himself and another, to slow down. Ethan watched it go. He handed Lily the wrench. She tightened the bolt. The gate swung clean. The lake caught the morning light the way it always did in April. Flat first, then bright, then gold. The kind of gold that only lasts a few minutes and means something different to everyone who sees it. Ethan Cole stood in the yard of the Harris house on a Saturday morning and breathed the cold lake air and felt the particular contentment of a man who has not gotten everything he wanted, but has gotten something rarer, a life that fits who he actually is. The gate was fixed. The roof was solid. His daughter was beside him, her cheeks smudged with grease, explaining in detail why the north hinge had failed before the south one. He listened. He was always listening, and somewhere up the road, in the unfinished halls of a building that was becoming, slowly, something other than what it had been designed to be, a man who had grown up with nothing was learning, late and at some cost, what nothing had always been trying to teach him. The real measure of a person is not what they build when everything is going well. It is what they do when the water is rising, the door is stuck, and the only light comes from someone else's flashlight. Wealth is not what you have accumulated. It is not the distance between your car and the nearest puddle. It is not the height of the ceiling above your head, or the thread count of the coat on your back. It is, in the end, the simple and difficult and endlessly renewable act of treating another person like they matter. Lily knew this. She had always known it. She had learned it in the way children learn the most important things, not from a lesson, but from watching someone she loved do it quietly, in the rain, without asking to be seen.